Hello everybody, I'm your host Too Elusive, and this time we are going to be looking at Sonic CD, which is one of the black sheeps of the franchise. There's at least two more that I'm aware of in the classic lineup, but we'll get to those when we get to those. Now if you're like me, you probably have not played a CD game, well I should say a Sonic CD game entirely, until it was re-released on the Gems collection on the GameCube, or when it hit the modern consoles and on your iOS systems, be it Android or Apple, whichever you have available to you. So why don't we go right ahead, take a look at this game, see if it holds up after all these years, or, make fun of it if it doesn't. That's what we do here anyway.
When you boot up the game, you're greeted by this really cool FMV cutscene that shows our favorite hedgehog in action. And I have to say that even by today's standards, the animation is solid. It's even accompanied by a really good track.
Don't fall behind. Say don't be late. Destination heaven. Stay alive. Now you and me. We're going to have fun. Say, let's off.
Hang on, that doesn't sound right. Was it this one? Ah, that's right. That other song is what you would have gotten if you were playing the Japanese or European versions of the game. More on that later. Anyway, the events of CD takes place sometime before Sonic 2 happened. During Sonic's journey to Never Lake, Little Planet apparently shows up on the last month of every year. At some point, Robotnik shackles this planet to a mountain and begins to turn it into a fortress for himself. Robotnik is also after the 7 Time Stones, which, as the name implies, are used to manipulate time. During Sonic's mission to stop Robotnik, Amy, a hedgehog who claims to be Sonic's girlfriend, much to his dismay, gets kidnapped by Robotnik's right-hand robo, Metal Sonic. What I find absolutely hilarious about this bit is the fact that the manual for this game, as pointed out by Andy in his video, mistakes Amy for Princess Sally, and if you don't know who she is, she's one of the main characters in Sonic Sadom, a show that I highly recommend checking out if you hadn't already. But now with Amy kidnapped, and Robotnik conquering Little Planet on his own, it's up to Sonic to save them both and create a brighter future. As far as gameplay goes, Sonic controls much like how he was handled in Sonic 2, only he now has a new move called the Super Peel Out. If you hold up on the D-pad and mash on the jump button, Sonic will run in place and begin to charge up his speed before he dashes off in the direction he's facing. The differences between this and his spin dash is that the latter will mow enemies down in his path, while the others leave Sonic vulnerable, but it charges quicker as a trade-off. Of course, this could all be mitigated if you were to hit down on the D-pad to immediately go into ball form in order to protect yourself. Plus, you have to admit that this move just looks really cool. At first glance, Sonic can be played much like the previous Sonic games before it. You race to the finish, beat the big bad, and move on. But what sets Sonic CD different from the other titles is that the time travel mechanic has been introduced in this game. Whenever the player runs past a sign that is labeled past or future, they're given the ability to travel to that time zone if they're able to maintain a certain level of speed for several seconds. By default, traveling to the future will bring him to the bad future of that level, where Robotnik has successfully conquered this zone, as the levels are filled with decay, heavy pollution, they're more mechanical than natural, and a lot more enemies and obstacles are present, all while backed up with a very eerie track. I want to give credit to the devs who took the time to pouring in the right aesthetics to really drill in the fact that this is indeed a future you don't want to have. Take Palm Tree Panic for example. You literally go from a bright colored nature-filled world with cheery music and what sounds like kids are playing to a dreadful mechanic forest that was once filled with so much life. And the soundtrack that plays along with it sure doesn't help, since now the music is filled with dissonance and even the kids sound like they've been roboticized. yeah, I bet you won't listen to this track the same way ever again. In order to prevent these bad futures from happening, the player needs to travel to the past and seek out two things they must destroy: a projector of Metal Sonic dominating over wildlife and a roboticizer. Destroying these two things will create a good future, and traveling to the future in that same round will also now have brighter colors, a cheery tune, no enemies, and fewer obstacles as the reward. It's also worth noting that you don't need to hunt for a Metal Sonic projector in the Metallic Madness level. You need to create a good future in each zone in order to get the good ending for this game. This must be accomplished for both round 1 and round 2, which is this game's versions of acts. While each zone contains 3 rounds like the first game, it's more forgiving here because the third round is just a short track to the boss fight. I should also point out that the third round will also take place in the future version of that zone too. So if you went through the trouble of creating a good future, you'll be greeted with that instead of its usual bad one. The good future also alters the appearance of the bosses you fight, but does not change the boss fight itself. It's all purely cosmetic. Now, if you don't feel like going through all that trouble of time traveling to each round, there is an alternative method of getting a good future, and that is by collecting the 7 time stones. Just like how it's done in Sonic 1, you need to get to the end of that round with 50 rings, then jump into the gold ring in order to enter the special stage. Unfortunately, like Sonic 1, the problems with this method are still present in this game too. Upon entering these special stages, you're thrown into an arena where your mission is to run around and destroy all of the UFOs in the stage before the time runs out. The timer also decreases much quicker if the player decides they want to go for a swim, but they can get more time by destroying the blue UFOs. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, I absolutely suck when it comes to these special stages, which is why I prefer the former method over the latter. But this is perfect for those who prefer a more streamlined option to get the good ending. Now, when it comes to the level design, Sonic CD probably has the most questionable design choices I've ever seen in a classic title. After coming off of the heels of Sonic 2, you would think CD would have used 2 example and have solid level design like before, but instead it's the exact opposite. The levels here feel more like it's a step backwards, a few steps backwards, even worse than Sonic 1 standards, and that's because at least the first Sonic had about 3 zones that had a nice flow to them. A lot of the time when I'm playing through these stages, I'm often asking myself the same question: why is this even here? Some of the obstacles make little sense, some stage elements are probably placed there just to be there, and none of the stages complement Sonic's design as a whole. Well, except for Stardust Speedway. Collision Chaos, for example, is Spring Yard Zone if someone told them to go apeshit with all the obstacles. Quartz Quadrant is a pretty stage with a whole lot of nothing, and the less we talk about Wacky Workbench, the better. But for those who need just a little context, imagine the whole stage as a bounce pad with lightning traps all over the place. The stages themselves are also more frustrating when you're trying to get the good ending with either method as presented before. Want to hoard 50 rings? You may want to practice extreme caution when trying to get to the end of the stage. There's going to be plenty of moments where you're going to be sent off somewhere only to land on some random pile of spikes or have an enemy that's just minding its own business. And if you're trying to go with a time travel method, you'll often need to figure out a clever way to keep up your momentum in order to get back to the past, because if you lose your momentum just as you're about to travel, you'll lose your ability along with it until you find another signpost. You can imagine the amount of hell I had to went through just to be able to pull this off in a stage like Title Tempest. It's even worse if you travel into the future by accident, because now you're required to travel back to the past twice. This wouldn't be as bad if the past signposts at least warp you back to the furthest point in time rather than just sending you to the present. Now granted, there are some instances where the developers made it easy to time travel if the player is able to locate them, but unfortunately that's not in every round, where some stages clearly need it more than others. Now the whole time I'm playing these stages, I couldn't help but wonder why these design choices are so backwards, for a lack of a better description, especially when Sonic became much more polished with the release of 2. The answer to that question lies in its time of development. Sonic CD was actually under construction right around the same time as Sonic 2, so many of the assets that were used in the first game were reused here. This would also explain why the gold ring method of entering special stages returned, and why the levels feel more inconsistent, just like Sonic 1's design, instead of having the more polished flow to them like how they are in Sonic 2. As for the boss fights themselves, I actually did enjoy how some of these fights turned out. Yes, they are easier compared to the fights in the first two games, and I can understand why people wouldn't like that. But the trade-off is that each of these fights had some kind of gimmick that made them unique for each other. For starters, you don't need to hit Eggman 8 times in order to destroy his machines. At most, you only need to strike him 3 times to end the fight. Sometimes you don't even need to hit him at all depending on what that gimmick is. My favorite would have to be the one in Quartz Quadrant, where you need to run Eggman's platform to the ground using Sonic speed, which is something you would expect the Hedgehog to do. Now, it goes without saying that out of all the classic games Sonic has to offer, CD is easily one of the most flashiest games in its classic lineup, and that is all because we're working with CD technology here. The sprite work that is done for all the levels, be it foreground or background, are lively and very pleasing to the eye, not to mention the soundtrack in this game is by far one of the best tracks a Sonic game has to offer. One thing I should bring up about the music is that it can vary depending on which region your game came from. Over here in the US, the music is going for more of an atmospheric setting, while the Japanese version went for more of an upbeat style that came straight out of a dance club. What's strange about the soundtrack for both games, however, is that each track in the game is altered to their respective regions with the exception of the past themes. Either way, both soundtracks offer something that the other does not, and you can't go wrong with listening to either one of them. If I had to say which song is the best example I can use to give you a taste of what each region has to offer, just listen to the boss themes. The Western release has a much more darker, creepier tone to it and gives you a sense of danger. While the Eastern release sounds more like a house party hosted by Eggman. Well, I think I said all that needs to be said about the original game itself. I say original because just like its previous two entries, the game also received an upgrade from Christian Whitehead. In fact, this is the first game he's enhanced and eventually led to the birth of Sonic Mania. So what exactly did he do to this one? Well, for starters, the game's controls have been refined not only on the normal stages, but also on the special stages. Sure, I still have trouble beating them, but it's more manageable here since Sonic no longer controls like a tank by comparison. This version also comes with a different method of saving your game. In the original, the game only saved your progress after you've cleared all 3 rounds. Now it's been programmed to save after clearing a single round, which makes it easier to reset the stage should you happen to travel to the future when you shouldn't have. The game also now gives you the option to choose between the Japanese or the US soundtrack, so now you can play through the entirety of the game with the music of your choice. The last thing I need to mention is that Tails also becomes a playable character once you've cleared the game, complete with his flight ability, and let me tell you, this guy is broken. Platforming, hunting roboticizers, boss fights, they don't mean a thing to this guy. Sonic CD as a game is an interesting title. I use the word interesting because while it had a number of things about this one that I liked, I felt that most of the experience was marred by the game's level design. On one end, it had a lot of flair. The game both looks and sounds really cool, plus I did love the concept of that time travel mechanic. Seeing all of the stages in a different time setting is something that hasn't been repeated in any other Sonic game outside of CD. On the other hand, its questionable level design will often argue with the game's mechanics, be it time travel or just trying to enjoy the core gameplay itself that Sonic 2 has established much better, which is momentum-based platforming. The only stage that has managed to get this very concept down and executed everything that CD was going for is Stardust Speedway. It's for that reason I can't really recommend this as a first title to newcomers, but rather a title that's worth checking out if you're curious enough. Thankfully, the Whitehead version, which is what I recommend, is accessible across the previous generation consoles, phones, and on Steam. That would remain true if it were not for the fact that by the time I've re-uploaded this video, Sega had released Sonic Origins, which contains all of the previous games we talked about so far, including this one and Sonic 3. So as of now, you can pretty much get all the games on every available platform through this collection. You'll see me go into further detail about this once Sonic 3 is re-uploaded, but for now, let's wrap this video up.
And there you have it, everybody. That was Sonic CD. Now, like I said before, Sonic CD is a pretty interesting game, but if you were to go ahead and take away that awesome soundtrack, the pretty visuals, you're pretty much going to be left with a game with a lot of questionable design that I just don't agree with. Nevertheless, it's still an interesting title that I would say you should check out if you are that curious. You're not missing out on anything if you don't. You aren't really getting too much of a gain if you go ahead and decide to play it. But do know that Tails is really broken. Anyway, next time we get in on this, we are going to talk about probably one of the best games in the classic Sonic lineup. It's a personal favorite of mine. I still play it a lot to this day. And I also want to go ahead and say that this game is still probably better than the... We'll save that for the review. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys later. Stay safe out there in these tough times. And as always, play until your thumbs fall off. Peace out, everybody.
You gotta do something. You gotta do something. Believe in yourself.